I'm sharing this with you anonymously. Back in the 80s, we used to get a lot of phone calls about people seeing a strange monster lurking in the storm drains. It started with young kids who would go down there, smoke cigarettes, and write graffiti on the walls. We didn't take it too seriously then, but it wasn't too long later that we started receiving phone calls about a strange, white-looking humanoid figure moving around down there. Sometimes our department would get phone calls in the middle of the night from the police, letting us know that there had been issues coming up again and again. Let me clarify. I used to work for a very special department that worked closely with the local police. I can't quite disclose the name of the department that I worked for, but to put it simply, we dealt with situations that the police couldn't deal with. This was one of them. We sent a few investigators down to the tunnels, kept watch, and waited for anything to come back. Now, the sewer system itself is large and rather complex. The city that we operated in, I won't disclose the city, but it wasn't a small town. There were miles and miles of area for this being to be. The area in which it was reported leaving the storm drain was heavily monitored. After days of heavy monitoring, we lost a few good men trying to track down this thing. We eventually took care of the potential crisis, and the threat had been removed entirely from the area. Even though I'm reaching out to you anonymously, there's still too much information that I can't reveal. I can't quite tell you how it got in there. I can't quite reveal exactly what it was, but I can say that the body was transported to a special facility that handles post-mortem cleanup on what I will call experiments. The most I'm willing to reveal is that this is a secret government facility in which only a few of us know exists, let alone its true whereabouts. I was told that it actually lies underneath the desert in Arizona, but I'm not too sure myself. I'm telling you this because this isn't the first time something like this has happened, and we've had to go in and play cleanup several times in my career with this, well, what I would call a company. I'm sorry that I can't divulge into many details. If this ever really picks up wind, the more details I release, the more it will be able to be traced back directly to me. I want you to know that there are more of us in these secret agencies that are wanting to come forward and tell you the truth. The American people deserve to know what's really going on. Maybe when the time is right. I wish you the best. I'm Native American, and my family holds many stories that many would consider false because of their lack of experience in the wilderness. Not only I, but my entire family has had run-ins with the wood people. Many call them Bigfoot, others Sasquatch, but we also have a special name for them. It's different with many tribes. I've had times where my family has been in our camper out in the forest, and we've had rocks thrown at our camper. Or, in the middle of the night, our camper gets pushed almost over entirely. We've heard yells, screams, bangs, and wood knocks all throughout the day and night. I live in a very active area for these things. I've also seen them on multiple occasions. They like to watch us from afar and observe us. They really like it when we have our powwows. They are usually pretty neutral creatures and don't bother us unless they feel threatened, or we enter their territory. I've been in the woods many times and have found trees ripped up out of the ground and stuck in upside down. They like to use markers a lot of the time to show their areas to us. We generally respect them, and so for the most part, they do not bother us. One of their favorite times of the year is in late summer when it comes to berry picking season. They love blackberries and huckleberries. There would be times growing up as a kid that I remember picking berries with my grandparents, and all of a sudden, we would smell this horrible smell. It smells like skunk, but it's a real unique and strong odor. There's one indication that there's close by, and that's generally their smell. When it's hot out in the summer, I've noticed that their smell tends to travel much farther, and you can really get a good whiff of them. We have encountered multiples of them before, and from what I grew up knowing is that they also live in tribes, just like we do. I believe they are a kind of people, a wild type of people. I know there has been other times where they've stolen my grandpa's kills before. He's killed many deer before, and if the carcass isn't taken care of immediately, and it's close by their area, the body will be gone in just a couple of hours. My grandparents always told us not to wander too far as a child into the woods, because when they would tell us stories about when they were younger, children used to go missing and were captured by these creatures to be eaten. I always obeyed and stayed relatively close to my family, so I never worried about it too much. We learned to respect their areas and territory, and they generally stay in their area. To anyone who doesn't believe these are real creatures, just hasn't spent enough time in the right areas. There's many of them, and if you're not careful, they will come after you. Normally, I don't tell a lot of people my story, because some of the people I've told tell me I'm making it up. But I promise on my life that this is true. Since this happened when I was young, I got used to the idea of it, and all the talk that Bigfoot isn't real became foreign to me since I've had so many first-hand experiences. Anyway, I used to play at my grandmother's house a bunch when I was little. I'm talking being a little kid, like 5 or 6, or somewhere around there. What's cool about her place was she always had this big pond and a bunch of tall grass and woods way out behind her house that I used to go play at. As a kid, I would go back there all the time and play games, skip rocks, and dip my feet in the pond. Sometimes I'd even find frogs. That was always a great time. There were several times, though, that I can remember that I would sometimes see this large, hairy man from time to time. He would usually be watching me from the tree line, and sometimes would come out and come closer to the pond. I remember one time I was playing with rocks or sticks or something, and I got this feeling someone was looking at me. I look up, and he's watching me from the other side of the pond, just staring at me. He didn't scare me at all, and I never felt danger. I didn't really know at the time it was a Bigfoot or anything. I guess I just thought it was a person or something. I'm not sure, because when you're 5 years old, you don't really understand that yet. I was shy, and I remember sometimes waving and saying hi. Sometimes asking if he wanted to play with me, but he just continued to stand there and stare at me. Most of the time, I would run back to my grandma's house, telling her the big hairy man had come to see me again, and she would just tell me to stop making up nonsense. She always thought I was lying. This continued for years, but I remember only seeing this thing in the spring and summer. My grandmother passed away when I was about 9 or so, and that's when I stopped going over there. So, that's what, 4 or so years? I saw this thing enough to know that it was more than likely the same one every time. I feel like it even recognized me too. You know the way someone looks at you when they remember or recognize you? I can't quite explain it, but that's the closest expression it would give me that I can explain in detail. It never really showed any emotion. I would say it was more mono-expressive and neutral than anything else. Like I said, it would usually stand behind the trees and watch me at times, or come closer to the pond and watch me, but that was about it. The pond itself was maybe only 40 or so feet around, so When he would watch me, he wasn't too far away. I was able to see pretty much most of his details. It was definitely a he. His hair was thick, matted and shaggy, and he had dark leathery skin on parts of his stomach and chest and his face. He looked very Neanderthal-like, and even though he had a nose like ours, his brow ridge was very pronounced. His lips were also very large. His eyes were dark, but reminded me more of a gorilla's eyes than just big black circles of nothing. He never showed his teeth or anything. His head was pretty much what you'd expect to see in typical Bigfoots. Practically no neck, cone-shaped top of the head, and very barrel-like body. I could sometimes tell when he was near because I could smell him, but not always. There were other times I'd be playing out there and never even know he was around, and I'd see him watching me. After my grandmother passed, I never went back to the area again, so I would imagine he's still probably there in the area. I'm 32 now, so this was roughly 25 or so years ago that this happened. My name is Brandon, and I live in Alabama. I'm about 14, and this story takes place in the year 2008 or 2009. I'm not really sure. I was quite young. So at the time, I lived with my grandmother and grandfather, which I'm not going to say exactly why. So we were beginning to move, and we were doing things around the yard, putting grass around the house. We had a few people helping my grandfather and grandmother, while me and my brother played around in the street and around the house, since it was not a very big house, but big enough for us to have a deck on it, and the back of it there is a small patch of woods just behind the house. So, me and my brother were just playing, and I don't know, I just felt like something was off around the woods behind us. Like something was there, keeping an eye on us, watching us. I would hear sounds of leaves and branches moving. Maybe it was the wind. Maybe not. Maybe 40 or 50 minutes later, we were pretty hungry and thirsty, so we ate and later on went back to play. So when we got back, we went to play, and about 10 minutes had passed. I totally forgot about the woods, and the sounds I had heard stopped. I stopped and just looked to see if I could see something, and I walked over there. Not really close, but close enough, and still nothing. It's like whatever was in there just stopped, so I didn't want to think about it even more, because I got paranoid easily and left, and didn't go back over behind the house. The next day, there was only a little grass left to cover the house, and the sun was setting, and I didn't remember to avoid the back of the house unless necessary. I was playing, and walked behind and stood. I had a feeling and that something else was there with me. I turned to my right, and I saw this big animal or something, like a werewolf or some sort of upright dog with yellow eyes looking at me, laying on the ground. I stood there for a few seconds and then ran to the front of the house, telling my grandparents what I just saw. Well, neither of them didn't believe me and told me to keep playing, so for the rest of the time, I just sat at the front of the house thinking that's what it was. I still don't know what it was or if it was there at all, and before I moved there, I swear I heard things outside in the woods, and sometimes I've seen things. Things first started really taking off around 2010. See, my best friend lives on the outskirts of a small nearby community, which is only about 10 miles away as the crow flies. There's a lot of heavy brush and forestation. It's all primarily secluded private property. The nearest neighbor is roughly a quarter-mile away in both directions. One night, my best friend's girlfriend had just left his house from spending the evening with him. They were having a picnic outside in his front yard together when he had thrown an apple out in his front yard. He had taken one bite out of it, tasted that it was too sour for him, and threw it. The next morning came, and he was outside his yard doing some cleaning up when he went to go find the apple that he accidentally left and noticed it was gone. He didn't put a lot of thought into it. He just thought an animal had gone and taken it. After all, it was just one apple. He threw it, figuring animals would come and eat it anyway, as he often let out food around for deer and other critters far away from his house to eat. It was about a week later when he came home from work to find a dead fox on his porch. It looked like it had been strangled to death. Its eyes were literally popping out of its skull. He said the kill was fresh and wasn't sure if somebody was just trying to mess with him or what. Then he looked next to the fox, and the same now rotting apple with one bite taken out of it was sitting right next to the dead fox. He began freaking out and was plenty sure that somebody was screwing with his head. He didn't call anyone though. Instead, he waited and gauged to see if anything else would happen. Time went on, and nothing else happened. These events that I just told you about happened in September, before it started to get chilly. And so fast forward about 6 to 9 months to the following spring, just as it was getting warm again. One evening, as he was having his girlfriend over for dinner at his house, his girlfriend started screaming that there was a huge hairy man in the front lawn. He flew out and opened his door. There, standing about 50 feet away in the front yard, was this big, black mass, as he described it. It was just standing there. His eyes tried to focus in on it in the twilight of the evening, but his eyes pulled him to the object that this thing seemed to be holding in its hand. It looked to be a dead raccoon, a rather large one too. He couldn't make out a face, definitive features, or anything else that would be specific to its description, but he said that he felt like it was staring right at him. This thing quickly darted behind a nearby tree once it realized he was looking at it. He said this creature seemed to be about 5 to 6 feet tall, if he had to guess, was really bulky and very shaggy and hairy. He knew instinctually that what he had saw outside of his house was a Sasquatch. Over the next couple of days, he thought more and more about it, and believed that this creature was the thing that had left the dead fox on his porch, along with the apple with one bite taken out of it the previous fall. He hasn't experienced any other activity around his house, or anything like that, since initially sighting this in his front yard. Hello. I have a few short experiences to tell you about. This all started when I was about 12 years old. I'm 19 now. My sister Zoe, father, stepmother at the time, and her 2 daughters, Jade, who was my age, and Maddie, who's my sister's age, were camping. We had really only been there for a day, and everything was fine. Then me and my sisters decided we were going to go to the stream by ourselves. My father gave us a walkie-talkie just so we can keep in contact while we were gone. Now the place we were going to was surrounded by bush, and to get there, you had to go down a little path through it. We spent a while with our shoes off and splashing in the water, when Jade said she could see something standing amongst the trees. We all looked and saw a figure. It was black, but you could tell it was the shape of a man.
You couldn't see the face. We stared for a few seconds, and then it disappeared. We forgot about it and kept playing in the water, but I felt a little uneasy. A while later, we all looked back, wanting to know if he was still there, and he was. Everything was silent. I could hardly hear the rapids in the little stream. We stopped looking. After about 20 minutes, we headed back to the campsite. The forest and all the noise around us was dead silent. My sisters lingered behind, and I was about 20 meters ahead of them. But we couldn't see each other. I heard a twig snap behind me, and I turned to look, assuming that they had caught up to me. No. I turned to see the tall, dark, black figure literally a foot behind me, so I started running. The whole time I could feel it close behind me. I ran as fast as I could until I was out in the open campground. It was gone. My sisters came out not long after and I told them what had happened. I asked, but none of them had seen it behind me, and they were too far behind anyway. The path was windy, so they were around a corner from me most of the time. Throughout our camping trip, we didn't see it around as much, but occasionally, we would just see this figure just standing there, watching us. Fast forward a couple years, and we go back there, with my father's new girlfriend and her daughter, Stella. I can't quite recall this trip as much, but I know for a fact that Stella saw it too.
Welcome back to another episode. Tonight, I bring you 3 terrifying stories of what can only be described as dogmen and werewolves. Enjoy.
Back in the 70s, I had a strange encounter with a beast in a recreational area called Beaver Lake. Beaver Lake resides in Arkansas and is a popular hotspot for camping and other outdoor activities. I was on a cross-country road trip and hopped from recreational area to area. It was just me and my sleeping bag by myself in a tent. The night itself was calm and hadn't seen many people or even heard much noise at all. There were some other people camping in a few campsites away, but for the most part, I was by myself. I had to set up my small tent, and I stuck my things in it and turned in early, just so I can get a head start on the road for the next area the next day. I was awakened sometime in the middle of the night by a strange noise. The best way I could describe it to you is it sounded like a humming noise. Someone with a deep, unnaturally deep voice. Whatever it was close by to my tent. I began to feel a presence getting closer and closer. I thought someone was going to try and break into my tent. I didn't have a weapon on me at all. I started to notice the hairs on my body standing up. There was something different about this presence. I've never felt such doom before in my life. I thought this was going to be the end, that I was going to be murdered. I sat frozen in my sleeping bag as this presence got closer and closer to my tent. It was pitch black outside, so I couldn't see a thing. Silence broke for only a couple of moments. I remember I was trying as hard as I could to breathe quickly and hold my breath. Then, out of nowhere, a loud sniffing sound broke the silence. I then realized that this was some large animal outside of my tent. It had to have been within 10 feet in front of my tent. I then heard the lowest growling noise I've ever heard in my life at that very moment. It was a rumble, a ferocious rumble. It sounded like a lion growling through an amplifier. I urinated myself in my sleeping bag. I was so scared. This was some large animal trying to get in my tent and wanting to eat me. A million thoughts raced through my head on what the hell this animal could be. It was so quiet, I couldn't even hear it moving around. Only the low humming that it emitted, and that growl. It was terrifying. It moved away from my tent. The humming got quieter and quieter, and I thought it was going away. Silence continued, and I laid there, frozen still in my sleeping bag, expecting this thing to come back at any second and rip right through that tent wall and grab me and rip my face off. Bang! Bang! 2 gunshots that sounded only about 100 feet away. Then I heard some screaming and commotion. I didn't even want to move from my spot. I knew whatever it was outside my tent was still there waiting around. I wasn't going to risk a thing. The commotion only got louder. I could hear people a little more clearly yelling, "What is that thing? Shoot it!" and other such commotion. My primal instincts of fight or flight came in, and I knew I had to make a run for it. Whatever it was must have run through someone else's campsite, since the commotion seemed to be moving away from me, luckily. Maybe it ran back into the brush over on the other end of the area. I knew I had to get up and do something, but I was too much of a coward to even move a muscle. The noise never seemed to completely die out, and even though I had only heard those 2 gunshots and yelling, the fear never ceased. The commotion died out after some time. I did continue feeling on edge, but the intensity of the feeling had eventually died down. I knew for a fact that I was not safe. I was not going to rely on a false sense of security, of silence around me. I continued to lie there in my tent, wide-eyed in my own piss, until daylight. I had no concept of time lying there. The sun must have started to rise because it was getting light enough that I felt it was time to carefully climb out of my sleeping bag and open up my tent. I slowly, ever so slowly, unzipped my tent, my heart about to jump out of my throat. Feeling like that animal was close by, I peered outside and didn't see anything. The area that I heard the commotion from last night didn't appear to have anybody else around. The entire area seemed empty. I figured if I just sprint back to my car and got the hell out of there, I'd make it alive. I grabbed my one bag and bolted for my car. I made it, turned my key, and got the hell out of there. I left my tent and a lot of other belongings in that tent. I didn't care though. I don't know what was outside my tent that night, but I know it wasn't a normal animal. It sounded large and dangerous. I was sure it was going to come back and eat me the whole time I was lying there. I'm just glad that I lived to be able to tell about it. This occurred back in 1999. My wife and I had our 4 young children, all boys, ages 3, 5, 7, and 10. We had them 2 years apart, roughly. Being parents was a wonderful experience as my career had been really excelling in recent years as a real estate investor. Because my parents lived in New England, we found ourselves settling down there, not far away from them. It was a much smaller town in the New England area itself. Your typical small town where everybody knows everybody. My parents had been living there their whole lives, their roots planted deep in the town. It's all they knew. The area in which we lived with our boys was around much thick wilderness. Lots of acres of rivers, trees, forests, you name it. A lot of the area around us looked very similar, with lots of open fields, pastures, forestation. There's a lot of farmland in the area, along with what comes with that. Animals of the wild, like deer and other small critters. If you had any feel for how the East Coast is like, these neighboring towns around us that were similar were small as well. Since I was investing and busy partnering with people out of state, I often traveled far from home. It was commonplace for me to be gone for days, if not weeks, at a time. I made pretty good money since I had been doing this for quite some time and allowed my wife to be a stay-at-home mom and a mother to my boys. She did a wonderful job raising them in hindsight. Since she was a stay-at-home mother, she was able to give them everything they needed. I never felt uncomfortable leaving them with her. We lived fairly peacefully, and nobody bothered us. We could never have asked for better neighbors either, and a quieter town to have settled down in. Much of the people around us were older and even cared about our young boys. They would be checking in on us from time to time to make sure that we were okay, and if we needed anything, since I was gone quite often, and they knew that. I remember I had just come home from a 5-day business trip out of state to look at a larger commercial property. My partner and I were checking it out to potentially do a deal and make big money. We had to do some further research before we proposed any sort of offer to the owner. I was only scheduled to be back home for no more than a week before flying back out. I remember pulling up to the house when my oldest boy runs out to greet me, gives me the biggest hug and tells me that there's something he wanted to talk about later. I went in and greeted my wife and kids, had a wonderfully pleasant dinner, and enjoyed my time home. The evening soon turned into night, and we put our younger boys to bed. Just as I was getting to lay down to bed with my wife, my oldest son, before going to bed, asked if he could talk to me. He pulled me to the side and told me about something scary he saw while he was playing outside. He proceeded to explain to me that a few days ago, him and all of his brothers were outside playing. The 3 younger ones went inside to get some food and snacks, while he remained outside playing. He said he began to hear a big dog growling at him when he turned and looked. He said he saw a big, hairy wolf standing from behind a tree. It had huge fangs, sharp claws, and red, glowing eyes. He screamed and ran back inside. This surprised me when my son told me this, because he'd been acting normal since I'd gotten home. He had given no inkling to there being something wrong. I'd asked him if his brothers had seen anything, and he just shook his head no. I couldn't tell him that I didn't believe him, so I held my son and told him how sorry I was that he saw what he did, and he should play close to the house from now on. I was going to check out our backyard tomorrow morning to see if I could find this monster. This seemed to make my son feel better, and he went off to bed. I decided not to say anything to my wife. I don't think she even knew about it. We'd only been living there a little while anyway. I lied there in bed that night, wondering what on earth my son could have seen. I knew he had quite the active imagination, but he'd never been one to make things up as outlandish as this. And trust me, he's quite the character. The fear in his eyes as he recounted to me what he saw told a different story. It deeply concerned me as a person and as a father. I believe he saw something, and it shook me to the core. The next few days were uneventful as my children and life played by fairly normally. The next incident that would happen was only a few days later. My oldest son had gone over to spend the night at a friend's house nearby. It was in the evening time, and the sun was setting. My 3 youngest boys were outside playing when I hear the door crash open. All 3 of them running and screaming. They kept yelling and screaming, "There's a monster in the backyard! There's a monster in the backyard!" My wife, who was right there with me, was just as concerned as I. I ran to the back door and opened it, and I scanned the area quickly, but didn't see anything. Then, about 70 feet away, I see this big, hairy shape run behind some trees. It shocked me, and I couldn't help but step back and gasp. This thing was running on 2 legs like a person does. I could hear the rustling noises. It was only dusk, so there was still enough light to see that something was indeed there. I kept my focus on where it went. While all of this was going on, my children were in the background, inconsolable, seeking comfort with their mother, refusing to go anywhere outside. I see this face then pop out from behind a tree, staring right at me. The eyes were the first thing that caught my attention. They had this unnatural, eerie glow to them, kind of like when your headlights reflect off an animal's eyes. The next thing that I took attention to was the longer-looking snout. In that instant, my brain clicked that what I was looking at was indeed not human. I slammed the door, trying to remain calm and not panic. I told my boys do not go back outside, and that we will deal with this in the morning. I made my way over to my liquor cabinet, pulled out a glass of some brandy, poured 2 shots, and downed them like they were water. It took a while for my boys to calm down, and eventually they did. That is, until about 1 in the morning. I'm jolted awake by the screams of my young boys. They all shared one bedroom. Without even hesitating, I run down the hall to their room as fast as I can, open the door, and see this hideous-looking set of drooling fangs against the glass. My stomach drops. My boys are screaming. The thing I had seen earlier was now looking in the window. Its eyes seemed to give off this scary red glow. It was so dark that all I could see were these sharp teeth and its eyes. I also noticed its wet nose pressed up against the glass, leaving mucus trails, the same way that a dog would when it presses its nose up against a glass. I went to grab my boys, but they were already jumping out of their beds, running and pushing past me. I turned around to the phone. I needed to call the police now. Something had to be done about this. My boys were so upset that they could not even sleep in their own room anymore. They ended up sleeping with my wife in our bed. I didn't sleep that night, period. I did, however, call the police, and an officer did come out to check things. He briefly looked around the property, but of course didn't find anything out of the ordinary worth investigating. Again, I didn't sleep that night. I decided to take a couple more shots of brandy to keep my nerves calm. It was now a day or so until I had to fly back out to go make a deal on this piece of property me and my partner were looking at. I couldn't leave my family to deal with this. The next morning, I rounded up my children and brought them over to their grandparents' house to stay for a few days. My oldest son was still at his friend's house, so he was unaware of what was initially going on at the time. My wife stayed with the kids, and I went off to make one of the biggest deals in my career. I flew out the following morning, met with my partner and the owner of the property, wheeled and dealed, pulled some strings, and made a great offer. We got the property. After a couple of days, I flew back home to go back and share the wonderful news. My children were still terrified to leave their grandparents' house, and my wife was unsettled to say the least. My parents were slightly aware of what was going on, but I didn't know that they didn't know the full picture. I talked to them and told them my family needed to stay a bit longer. I was going to patch things up at the house. My oldest son, who had gotten back from his friend's house just days ago, wanted nothing to do with it. He then went and stayed with his other friend for the following week. I needed to find out what was going on. When I got back to our house, it was dark. I don't mean just dark due to the absence of light and nothing being on. I'm talking darkness with feeling to it. There was an evil presence in the air. It felt unnerving, made the hairs on the back of your neck stand up like you were at the edge of your seat. I thought if I could hold down the fort for just a day or two and make sure everything was fine, the family could come back and we would be all A-okay. As I'm making my way up to my porch, I noticed these large canine prints in the ground. I stopped and looked down. These were huge. My sister, growing up, had a Great Dane, so I know what big dog prints look like. These were more than double the size of a Great Dane. The impression on the ground was much heavier than that of a Great Dane as well. My stomach knotted. I couldn't face the idea that some large dog was trying to get into our house. That feeling was only further validated as I used a flashlight, looked all around the house, and found these footprints everywhere. The most chilling part was that they were mostly outside my boys' window. It had been rather rainy the past week, so the ground was wet enough to leave imprints. I figured that it was probably a good idea if I talked to my closest neighbors, just to see if they had any intel on the situation. Maybe they had seen things I hadn't and not told us about. They were open people, good people, both sets of couples that lived around me. That's just the kind of people they were. I mean, gosh, they would run over and give us a gallon of milk if we needed it. I trusted them. I went over to our nearest neighbor to speak directly with them and found out that even though they hadn't seen anything weird, their 2 cats had gone missing 5 or so days ago. These cats had been around the neighborhood, and I would usually see them pulling up to the house since they loved the catnip that was in our front garden. I hadn't seen them or any trace of them since, which was odd, since, like I said, they were always around. That struck me as disturbing. The other neighbor I talked to on the other side of our house told me that he had been hearing noises and sounds that spooked him early in the morning, like something was clawing at his front door, trying to get in, wiggling his door handle. The feeling of uneasiness lingered heavily around the whole neighborhood, it felt like. We were dealing with some large animal of some kind. I'm not sure to this day what it was. I spent the next few nights at our house alone, drinking to calm myself, only experiencing the feeling of gloom and doom, but never hearing or seeing anything. The entire time I felt like I was being closely watched. Hunted is a better term. I hardly slept, hardly ate, and by the 3rd day I decided a change was going to happen. I went and visited my wife and our boys, who I hadn't seen in days, being at my parents' house. I told them our house wasn't safe to go back to anymore, and that maybe it was time that we thought about moving. Even though we had only been living on this property for a little while, it wasn't worth putting my family through this, now, terror that had engulfed my home. My family could not keep staying at my parents' house, even though they were most welcome and loved. I had to make the choice. I put in an offer for a house a couple of states away, far away from where we lived. I got it. I broke the news to my wife and kids, told them we were moving and that it was somewhere safe. Honestly, I think my wife and kids were put through so much through this whole monster thing that they didn't even really fight the fact that I picked somewhere states away and we were going to just uproot and move. We didn't waste any time. We went back to the house, well, the wife and I, loaded up everything we had in 2 days flat, grabbed our kids and took off and never looked back. I know my wife still misses that house to this day, but even she felt so uncomfortable there. She later revealed to me that weeks before our son had his backyard incident of seeing something with glowing eyes and fangs, that she would see this strange dog-like animal approaching our bedroom window at night. She was always too terrified to tell me. She thought I would ridicule her and disbelieve her. She felt it was best to keep it to herself. I can't believe whatever that thing was watched me and my wife sleep. It made me sick, and to know that it wanted to prey on my young boys. I don't know what that thing was, animal, beast, or demon. I hope it's still not there terrorizing my neighbors, because they were great people. I just hope whatever it was is now gone for good. This may be too long for some people to read, but I had to share it anyway. This is the first time I am posting anything online about this. I'm a 24-year-old woman, married, and recently moved back in with my parents due to moving back to the town I grew up in. My husband and I are taking our time looking for our own place due to wanting something nice in the area that is usually hard to find. These events take place in my parents' house, starting back 10 years ago. A description of the house for a bit of better understanding. It's a 2-story, brick and stone house in city limits, but still surrounded by nothing but wilderness. You have to go through a garage that leads into the kitchen, with the first bedroom to your left. Past the kitchen is the main living room, and to the right is the hall that is very open. In this area, you will find the main dining room and second living area, but if you continue straight, you will see the staircase to your left, and even further straight is my parents' bedroom and bathroom. Going up the stairs, you will come to the third living area. Yes, this is a huge house with 2 sets of French doors side by side that led to the outside balcony. Going straight, taking a sharp left leads you to the other 3 bedrooms and 2 bathrooms. This is where the first encounter takes place. The first time I stepped foot into this house, I immediately felt like something was off. Not just the house, but the entire area around it. I never liked the property. It just felt like something wasn't right. I felt a dark presence, but I didn't know what or who it was. I brushed it off, thinking I was just reading too much into it. I learned to always trust your gut instinct, and when you feel these things, it's for good reason. I continued to feel this for the next couple of years, and because of this, I didn't enjoy visiting my parents a whole lot. There would be times at night I would be sneaking a cigarette outside, and I'd get this awful feeling like I was being watched. Sometimes I swear I would see this huge shadow moving around just beyond the light of our porch. Sometimes I'd swear I felt I was being stared down from the woodline by our house. I never cared too much to go and investigate to find out what it was. My parents liked to gamble a lot, and back then, so they would ask me to babysit my baby brother and sister one day on the weekend. My boyfriend, who is now my husband, loved them, so he would always babysit with me. The first few times, I really didn't pay attention to the feeling, because we would be busy playing or eating with the kids. After that, things kind of chilled out and we would end up watching movies until it was time for us to go to bed. Now, my husband is a freak of nature. It's like he falls asleep the second his eyes are closed. He's a heavy sleeper, and he's a lucky man for that. Me, on the other hand, it takes me forever to get comfortable enough to wind down my mind. I also don't sleep well, even when I do finally get to sleep. This night was the first time I saw and heard something in this new house. In this room, the bed is facing the doorway, but not directly in front of it. With the double doors open, you could see the front of the staircase all the way down the hallway, as long as the light is on, that is. This night, only one of the hallway lights were on. I was lying in bed with the TV on, but the volume down so low that I could hear if one of the kids called me. I was almost asleep when I hear a faint tapping on the window, like if someone were to take an object, a hard object, and tap lightly. I opened my eyes a bit and waited for the sound again, but it doesn't happen. I don't think anything of it. I close my eyes and begin to drift off again. A few minutes later, I hear it again. So I opened my eyes and waited. But again, I never saw or heard it. This time, I sit up and listen. A bit spooked, but nothing I can't handle. I get a bit nervous, but still I go to check to see what it was. As I'm climbing on a bed, the shadow being casted on the hallway wall from the window showed this large silhouette of a dog trying to get into the window, it looked like. I held my hand over my mouth to keep from screaming. Confused and thinking I must be dreaming it up, I go back to bed, this time closing one of the double doors. The sound kept going on as I tried to force myself back to sleep and convince myself this wasn't real. It was like it was trying to get my attention, like it wanted me to see it. The sound eventually ceased and I fell asleep. I know that because I woke up just a few hours later, right around 2:30 in the morning, when I feel like someone or something is right outside my bedroom window. I felt as though something was staring me down into my very soul. Usually, when I opened my eyes, I would see the green glow of the alarm clock on the bedside table, but this time I saw nothing. It was pitch black. I couldn't even see the hallway light on, and the TV had turned itself off. I felt like I couldn't move. I was awake now and scared to my bones. I was finally able to call out my husband's name loud enough to wake him. He reached over and turned on the light, and right then I saw this massive silhouette from the window in our room, with tall, pointy ears. I thought it was a werewolf. I freaked out and started crying. Even my husband was freaking out, and he didn't even believe in those things. My husband runs out of the room, and the huge shape disappears. When he gets back into the room, he has a baseball bat in his hand and he's ready for blood. I turned on all the lights in the room, hoping that what I saw outside was just some horrible nightmare, and eventually was able to fall back asleep, but it took me forever. The next day I told my mom about what happened. She had been hearing noise outside the house for a few months on and off. She said that sometimes she would get the feeling that she was being watched and would occasionally hear tapping on the glass. She didn't tell anyone because she did not want to scare us kids. She actually went out and put some trail cams up around the outside of the house one day and around the woods. She let it go on for about a week or so, and when she went back to go check in on it, all the trail cameras were gone. All of them. It looked like they were ripped off the trees that they were put onto. No trace of them anywhere. I knew it had to be this evil entity that was visiting us. This werewolf thing. This being continued visiting our house every few nights, tapping on the glass, wanting us to open the curtains to look at it. I ignored it the best I could every time. You always knew when it was near because you just felt a strong presence of evil. There was one night I remember where I left my curtains open by accident and woke up to this demonic-looking wolf face staring right at me. It was the most hideous, evil-looking thing I've ever seen in my life. I cried immediately. This wasn't night terrors. This was real life. A real-life werewolf that was wanting to get me. It even grinned at me, the most sinister, evil-looking grin that I've ever seen. I retreated to the upstairs and hid and fell asleep in the bathroom. The next day, we soon asked a friend to cleanse the house, thinking this was some demonic entity that had manifested in a physical shape and was haunting us. After a couple of rituals and saging the house and property, everything seemed to be okay. The evil presence has stopped showing up. Until now, I have been living in this house for a month and a half. For the last 3 weeks, I have been seeing this thing constantly, especially when I'm alone. Because of this, I won't stay alone anymore. I get this strong feeling of being watched. I keep my curtains and blinds shut now indefinitely, and at night will be woken up to the sound of this thing heavily breathing on the other side of my window, wanting to get in, wanting to get me. Oh, and just an FYI, I am the 3rd generation on my mother's side of the family that has an attraction, I guess we'll call it, to these things apparently. My dad's side of the family has, in the past before I was born, practiced black magic and occultism. I don't like speaking to them, and I won't dabble in any of the spiritual stuff that most people do, like rituals, Ouija boards, etc. I stay as far away from it as possible, and I recommend that you do too. Even if you are careful, these beings can torment you and follow you for a long time, even after you are dead.